Jon Snow stood at the edge of the war-torn courtyard in King's Landing, his breath turning to steam in the cold morning air. The embers of the city still glowed faintly, the charred bones of buildings reduced to blackened husks after the final battle for the Iron Throne. It had been only a fortnight since the armies had clashed in the streets, since Daenerys Targaryen had fallen, and since the realm had been reshaped by the hands of those left standing. Now, the question of succession and the shape of the Seven Kingdoms rested on a fragile peace, one that would be tested by new crowns and new allegiances. Bran Stark, the newly crowned king of the Six Kingdoms, after the North's decision to remain free under Sansa's rule, had summoned him quietly on that fateful day. Jon had ridden from the ruins of the Red Keep, unsure of what destiny awaited him. He was haunted by the memory of plunging his dagger into Daenerys' heart. He could still feel the bone-deep tremor of that moment, of her eyes wide with betrayal and heartbreak. Duty had guided his hand, but love had not died in an instant. That love, and the sense of guilt that followed, still twisted like a knife inside him. At first, Jon feared exile again. He had prepared himself for the idea of going back to the Wall, or beyond it, relinquishing whatever claim he might have had to anything in Westeros. He was ready to pledge himself to the realm's safety one last time, wandering into the icy wilderness as some penance for his crimes. But to his astonishment, Bran had not asked him to return to the North. He had not declared him a traitor. Instead, in front of the surviving lords and ladies of the realm, Bran had named Jon Snow the Lord of Storm's End. The Baratheon line, after much tragedy and treachery, had dwindled, and Gendry Baratheon had expressed a desire to fight for the new king elsewhere as master of war. He had no hunger for lording over the imposing fortress on the storm-lashed southern coast. Or perhaps Gendry simply understood that the realm needed new bonds, new alliances, and a figure who might unite old loyalties in the south. Thus, Storm's End was given to the one man who wore legacy like an invisible shroud, an heir to both ice and fire. And so Jon had found himself traveling south of all directions. At each weary step of his new journey, the landscape changed from the cold, brooding hills outside the capital to the rolling green fields of the Stormlands. Skeletal war horses hobbled through muddy roads, carrying the battered knights and sworn swords who followed him. The once proud Storm's End banner, black stag on gold, now included a faint white wolf curled at the corners, sewn by the seamstresses who insisted that the fortress needed to honor Jon's heritage. Jon had neither confirmed nor denied that he wanted such a crest, but none had asked his opinion. Destiny, it seemed, was forging him anew, whether he liked it or not. They arrived at Storm's End in a torrential downpour. The massive curtain walls rose out of the rocky coastline like a vigilant sentinel, battered by winds that howled day and night. The sea crashed against the cliffs below, white foam rising and vanishing into the blackness. Torches illuminated the gatehouse, and the castle guards admitted them. If Jon had imagined receiving a triumphant welcome, reality was far more subdued. The knights who remained in the fortress were weary from years of war. Some still doubted that the realm could know peace. Others whispered discontent that a northern bastard, even if once proven to be more, would now claim dominion over the Stormlands. Jon dismounted amidst the swirling wind and rain, water sluicing down his cloak. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and Ghost, the albino direwolf that followed him everywhere, seemed half-spectral against the gloom. Thunder cracked above them. The men who had traveled with him lowered their heads, waiting for instruction. Jon stood there for a moment, gazing at the fortress that would now be his home. He could not suppress a quiet sense of awe. Storm's End looked like it had weathered 10,000 storms and would weather 10,000 more. He thought of the many stories old Nan had told him as a boy about the wizard who built this place with spells woven into the very stones. Even the dragons of old could never fully break it. And now he was to rule here. That first night, in the great hall, the high table set with meager offerings, Jon Snow barely touched his food. He endured the stares, the whispered conversations, the curious gazes of the lords, knights, and ladies who looked to him for leadership. He hardly knew how to act in this new role. He had been Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, then King in the North for a short, tumultuous time, but Storm's End seemed to demand something different. Sansa had once told him that politics in the South was a dance, and those who couldn't keep up would be trampled. He hoped he could learn the steps in time. The hall was dim, shadows flickering over the thick stone walls. The sound of the rain outside was a constant roar, as if the wind and ocean were locked in an endless duel. When Jon rose to speak, all eyes fell upon him in expectant silence. He felt the weight of every gaze. Memories of the Red Keep, of the Wall, of Winterfell, all converged in that instant. He realized that leading men in battle was a different challenge than leading them in peace. And this new peace was still fragile as glass. He cleared his throat and, in as steady a voice as he could muster, addressed them. "I am Jon Snow," he said, and heard the unspoken hush as they waited to see if he would claim Targaryen or Stark. He said nothing of either. "By the decree of his grace, King Bran the Broken, I have been named Lord of Storms, and I know what you must think. Some of you expected Gendry Baratheon or another Stormlander to hold this seat. I give you my word, I did not seek this honor. Yet it's been given, and I'll guard it with my life. I fought to save the realm from the long night, and I fought to liberate King's Landing when I believed the realm was in danger. I vow to protect these lands, to see them prosper, and to serve the people who look to this castle's strength. I ask only for your honesty and your faith. And if you doubt me, if you question my right to be here, speak openly. I will not punish truth." A murmur rippled through the hall. Some nodded slowly, their faces guarded. Others quietly sipped wine, unwilling to voice doubts in that moment. But the silence spoke volumes. He could sense the tension. They were loyal to the Baratheons, had been for generations, and here was this newcomer who might very well be half Targaryen. The stigma of dragonfire lingered heavily in the southern air. Jon knew it would take time. He lowered himself back into his seat, letting out a breath. He felt Ghost settle near his feet. One step at a time, he told himself. The war was done, but new struggles would emerge. Everyone he had ever loved or lost had taught him the same lesson. Duty was a heavy burden. In the days that followed, Jon walked the halls of Storm's End, acquainting himself with its labyrinthine corridors and battered towers. He spent hours with the stewards and the castellan, learning about the fields and villages that surrounded the fortress. The lands of the Stormlands had been ravaged by war. Small folk had been conscripted into armies, or had starved in the lean years, or had seen their homes destroyed by marauders. Roads had fallen into disrepair, trade routes had withered, and banditry lurked in the thick forests. Winter might have been receding, but the shadows of the realm's chaos still clung to the edges of every path. Jon took careful note of everything. He listened to the complaints of farmers whose crops had failed. He listened to blacksmiths who had run out of iron. He listened to soldiers who had not been paid. And with each new voice, he felt the weight on his shoulders grow. Yet he also saw flickers of hope. The people yearned for stability, for a leader who would give them a chance at a normal life. He recognized their desperation from his time in the north, when the threat of White Walkers loomed. Now there were different threats: starvation, bandits, the remnants of old feuds. But maybe, just maybe, he could bring a measure of peace to a place that had known too little of it. Tormund Giantsbane was among his closest companions, though the wildling chafed under the southern skies. Tormund was restless, forever complaining about the heat, even when the storms soaked him to the bone. "This castle is a cage, Jon Snow," he'd say. "What good is all this stone to keep out the wind? Out there, in the real storms, you can see the sky, see the enemy. This is walls and corners, corners and walls." Jon merely smiled at the big man's grumbling. He was grateful for Tormund's presence. Loyalty was a precious commodity, and Tormund stood by him as a true friend. Over time, a small council began to form. These were the men and women who would help Jon govern. Sir Davos Seaworth arrived at Storm's End one evening, his hood soaked and his expression determined. Though Davos had served Stannis Baratheon once, and then sided with the North, he had come to believe in Jon Snow's character. Bran had offered Davos a position in King's Landing, but Davos refused. "I've grown tired of King's Landing," he said with a wry grin. "I'll serve the realm better here in the Stormlands if you'll have me." Jon accepted gladly, for there was no man he trusted more in matters of ships, trade, and loyalty. Brienne of Tarth came as well, though she split her time between King's Landing, the north, and her home of Evenfall. She saw it as her duty to help ensure a lasting peace, and Storm's End was the center of many strategic roads. When she arrived, she brought news of Sansa's rule in the north and Arya's voyages across the seas. She also brought what she could of her unwavering sense of honor, which lent Jon a steadier compass when politics threatened to muddy his decisions. Slowly, day by day, the fortress adjusted to its new lord. Jon's challenges were manifold. The harvest was meager, requiring him to bargain with Highgarden for grain. Pockets of outlaws still roamed, requiring him to dispatch men-at-arms to secure the roads. Displaced smallfolk sought refuge at Storm's End's gates, and Jon had to find them plots of land or places of work. The library within Storm's End was small, but he spent evenings reading old histories of the Storm Kings, from Durin Godsgrief to the Baratheons. He wished Samwell Tarly were by his side, but Sam was busy assisting Bran with the matters of the royal court, forging a new era of record-keeping and scholarship. Still, Jon gleaned what he could from musty tomes, striving to understand the region he now led. One night, the wind was especially fierce, shrieking through the arrow slits in the castle walls. Jon stood on the ramparts, gazing out at the sea, the waves illuminated by intermittent flashes of lightning. Ghost was a silent presence at his side. He remembered the snows of Winterfell, the quiet hush of the north. Here, everything was thunder and crashing surf. He felt strangely alive in the chaos of it. Perhaps that was the nature of the Stormlands, facing conflict head-on, enduring the worst the sky and sea could hurl, and remaining steadfast. Yet no matter how much he tried to push away his past, it would not be denied. In the silent hours, Jon thought of Daenerys. Sometimes he saw her as she was when they first soared on dragons above the frosty peaks near Winterfell, full of wonder, bravery, and that glint of hope for the throne she believed was her birthright. Other times he remembered the aftermath of King's Landing, the smell of ash choking the air, and her eyes blazing with zeal. He remembered how his hand trembled with the knife. And always, he felt the quiet agony of duty. Another ghost that would not leave him was the truth of his parentage. Aegon Targaryen, sixth of his name, was a title that felt too heavy, too foreign. Jon had once told Varys he didn't want it, and he told Tyrion the same. But here, in the Stormlands, rumors floated on every breeze. The small folk whispered, "He is Rhaegar's son. He is the rightful king." Jon wanted no throne, but that did little to quell the murmurs. Worse, it made some of the local lords suspicious. They wondered if King Bran had placed him in Storm's End to keep a potential rival close. Jon could do nothing but meet each stare with calm, offering no claim beyond the seat he'd been granted. As the weeks turned into months, the new Lord of Storm's End found a rhythm in his duties. He presided over disputes among local lords, arbitrated feuds, collected taxes, and oversaw the restoration of battered farmlands. He dispatched ravens to King's Landing with regular updates. Gendry, now master of war, sometimes replied with humor and encouragement, reminding Jon of their time together on the fields before the long night. "Build ships," Gendry advised. "The Stormlands have excellent timber, and the realm needs a new fleet, especially now that the Royal Navy is so diminished." Jon took this advice to heart. He spoke with shipwrights in the coastal villages, offering incentives for them to move their trade closer to Storm's End. Soon, the docks below the castle bustled with saws and hammers. Meanwhile, in the Great Hall, small ceremonies marked the knighting of commoners who had distinguished themselves in service. Jon held no prejudice against those born of low station. He himself had been marked a bastard for most of his life. He rewarded skill, loyalty, and honor over lineage. This decision, though met with some grumbling from older knights, gradually improved morale. The small folk began to see in Jon a lord who might actually care for their welfare rather than just his own glory. Despite these accomplishments, tensions lingered. Storm's End had historically looked to King's Landing for guidance, but now, with the North seceded, everything felt different. Some Stormlords wondered if the Stormlands could also assert more independence, playing their own game of power in the shifting political landscape. Others, staunchly loyal to House Baratheon, questioned why Gendry had relinquished the seat so readily. Jon found that forging alliances among these lords required delicate diplomacy, something he was still learning. Sir Davos helped, as did Brienne when she was present. But it was Jon's face and voice they all looked to when final decisions were made. Then came word from the Reach that certain lords, minor lords, but lords nonetheless, were refusing to ship grain because of old grievances with Storm's End, grievances that Jon barely understood. He traveled to those lands himself, meeting with them in their manors and halls. He explained the new peace, the new responsibilities, and offered what reparations he could. Some negotiations took days, with endless dinners and parley, polite conversations laced with barely veiled threats. Jon found it exhausting. Yet he learned to navigate the labyrinth of southern courtesy, always mindful of Sansa's advice. A single misstep could cause a feud to ignite, and the realm was too fragile to endure more conflict. On one such trip, Jon ventured to a lush estate near the Manor. The lord there was young, his father having died in the war. He greeted Jon with politeness, but Jon could sense the bitterness beneath. Over cups of spiced wine, the young lord finally let his grievances spill forth. "My father died when the Stormlands marched for the Dragon Queen. Our fields were burned in the crossfire when the Lannisters retaliated. Who will pay for that? And now I'm asked to give up my grain for Storm's End's hungry mouths." Jon listened quietly. He spoke of unity, of trying to repair the realm, of building a future free from the mistakes of the past. At the end of the night, the Lord relented, though not without securing Jon's promise to support certain trade concessions. Jon rode away, thinking, this is how peace is forged. 1,000 small bargains, 1,000 measured compromises. Upon returning to Storm's End, drenched from a sudden gale that battered his party on the road, he found a raven waiting for him. The seal was from the Iron Islands. Asha Greyjoy's bold handwriting declared that her people were uneasy, that they had grown accustomed to plundering the coasts during times of chaos, and she was trying to rein them in under the new peace. She hinted that she might need Storm's End's help in patrolling the seas. Jon realized just how fragile this new era was. The realm was no longer at war, but each region was still grappling with its own complexities, each lord or lady wanting to cement their position before the dust fully settled. Determined not to let the Ironborn destabilize the coasts, Jon summoned Sir Davos and a few loyal knights, discussing the possibility of constructing or repairing warships. Storm's End's new shipyards had already launched 2 small vessels. Perhaps they could build more. A presence on the sea would give the Stormlands leverage, help keep the shipping lanes safe, and bolster the fragile alliances. Gendry's words rang true. Build ships. While all this transpired, letters came from the north. Short, direct messages from Sansa, who shared news of how winter's grip was loosening, of how the harvest was shaping up, of how the new queen in the north was consolidating power among the northern lords. Arya's letters, when they arrived at all, spoke of far-off lands, of sun-scorched deserts and uncharted seas. Jon missed them both fiercely. He was glad they had their destinies, as he had his, but the longing for his family never truly subsided. One evening, as a pale moonlight bathed the high battlements of Storm's End, Brienne of Tarth stood with Jon, leaning on the stone crenellations while Ghost lay at their feet. Lightning flickered in the distance. Brienne's voice was thoughtful. "You've done well here," she said, glancing sideways at him. "The Stormlords are calmer. The roads are safer. You've begun repairs to the watchtowers along the coast." Jon exhaled, watching the sea churn far below. "I'm only doing what must be done. There's still more to fix than I can count." "True," she conceded, "but peace is a rare thing. Enjoy it when you can." He couldn't find words to reply. The notion of enjoying anything felt foreign, given the burdens he carried. But Brienne's counsel stayed with him, resonating in his thoughts late into the night. The next morning he rose before dawn and patrolled the fortress walls, breathing in the salty air. The wind whipped at his cloak, the gulls cried overhead, and below, fisherfolk were setting out in small boats. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel a measure of pride. The people were looking to him. He was protecting them. Perhaps this was the fulfillment of his vow to protect the realm, just on a smaller, more personal scale. Still, some shadows would not be banished. One day, a small party arrived from Dorne. They were emissaries sent by the new Princess of Dorne, a woman who had emerged from the ashes of the Martell line, forging alliances among the scattered Dornish lords. She wished to establish trade with Storm's End and the Six Kingdoms. Over a week of negotiations and feasts, tensions flared. The Dornish had not forgotten the Targaryen dragons that once conquered them, nor had they forgotten the horrors of the war that had spilled across the continent. Jon did his best to show them hospitality, even hosting a small tourney in their honor, though it was a modest affair compared to the grand tournaments of old. During the festivities, as knights tilted at rings and sparred in the courtyard, Jon sat among the onlookers with the Dornish envoy. Laughter mingled with the clatter of steel. But every so often, the conversation turned to the question of bloodlines. A Dornish noble asked pointedly, "Is it true you're the son of Rhaegar Targaryen?" The question was delivered with careful politeness, but Jon saw the glint of curiosity in the man's eyes. He could sense the hush that fell over those near enough to hear. Jon's jaw tightened. He wanted to refute it, to revert to the comfortable lie of being a northern bastard. But he knew well enough that the truth was out there, and denial would only fuel further speculation. So he answered simply, "That is what I'm told. But if so, it changes nothing. I've sworn myself to the realm. My loyalties are here, not to House Targaryen." "Nay." The noble studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Jon saw he had not fully convinced the man. Perhaps no one could be fully convinced. But at least the Dornish seemed satisfied enough to continue their negotiations. Trade in wines and spices was arranged, with the promise of further commerce. Nonetheless, Jon felt the eyes of the Stormlords upon him, measuring him anew in the light of these open acknowledgments about his parentage. One night, after the Dornish had departed, Jon found himself unable to sleep. He wandered into Storm's End's old godswood. Though here in the south, it was little more than a small courtyard with an oak tree and a simple fountain. No heart tree grew there, but he felt some measure of peace in the rustling leaves. Ghost padded silently behind him, a pale shadow in the moonlight. Jon knelt by the fountain and closed his eyes, trying to think of the old gods, trying to remember the quiet hush of the weirwoods in Winterfell, the face carved in the trunk. It felt so far away. He whispered into the darkness, "What am I meant to do now? Why was I spared? And why am I here, if not to do something of worth? Is this my home, or am I merely keeping it warm for another?" The only answer was the drip of water and the rustle of leaves in the wind. In the weeks that followed, word spread throughout the realm about a potential threat rising in the Stepstones. Pirates, free companies, and exiles from Essos had begun gathering there, harassing shipping lanes. King Bran's small council debated whether to send a royal fleet to deal with the menace. Gendry favored a show of force, but the crown's treasury was still depleted from the war. Many lords in the Reach and Stormlands demanded action to protect their trade. Jon's new shipyards had produced a few war galleys, but not enough to fend off a large-scale pirate threat. Tensions rose as merchants feared ruin, and rumors of raids drifted along the coast. Jon knew this could be a test of Storm's End's loyalty and capability. If he did nothing, commerce in the southern seas would suffer, and discontent might spread among the lords. Yet had he committed too many resources, the fortress and its lands might be left vulnerable. Balancing these needs weighed heavily on him. He conferred with Davos, who knew the seas better than most. "A small expeditionary force might show them we mean business," Davos said, scratching his beard thoughtfully. "But we must coordinate with King's Landing to ensure they send a supporting fleet, or we risk getting overwhelmed." Ravens flew back and forth, discussions ensued, and at last it was decided that Jon would send a modest naval force, led by Sir Davos, while Gendry arranged for reinforcements to depart from King's Landing. The nights before the galleys set sail were tense. Jon walked among the crews, speaking words of encouragement, feeling the restless energy that precedes any confrontation. The banners of Storm's End fluttered in the salt wind, the crowned stag in black on a field of gold, with a faint white direwolf ghosting along the edges. Soldiers took heart that their lord cared enough to be among them. When dawn broke, the ships cast off, their sails billowing, cutting across the choppy waters toward the stepstones. Days stretched into weeks. Jon received only scattered reports by Raven. The first engagements with pirates had gone relatively well. Davos had outmaneuvered them near an islet, capturing 2 pirate skiffs. But new, more formidable pirates had arrived, rumored to be allied with sails from Lys. Davos was trying to hold them off until the Crown's fleet arrived. Jon felt the old anxiety of waiting, the helplessness of commanding from afar. He spent restless nights in the war room, analyzing maps and currents. He remembered how powerless he'd felt at the Wall when the wildlings or White Walkers were on the move. Leading from the rear never got easier. At last, news came that the Crown's reinforcements had reached Davos just in time, routing the pirates in a decisive skirmish. A band of sails had turned tail rather than face a 2-pronged attack. The shipping lanes near the stepstones were once again open, though scattered pockets of pirates remained. Davos wrote that he would press on to ensure the threat was fully suppressed. Jon read the letter in the presence of the Stormlords, who celebrated the victory with cautious optimism. It was a small triumph, but it showcased Storm's End's contribution to the realm's security. The Southern Lords began to look at Jon with more respect. He had acted decisively, with the backing of the Crown, and proven that the Stormland still carried weight in naval affairs. In the aftermath of this success, lords who had once eyed Jon warily now sought his audience, offering their fealty more openly, discussing new projects, roads, markets, alliances. Jon found it both gratifying and overwhelming. He had never courted power, yet here it was, landing in his lap. Storm's End was becoming a linchpin in the southern half of the kingdom. The interplay of politics demanded constant vigilance. Certain houses wanted more favorable trade terms. Others wanted a say in how the new roads were built. Still others wanted a voice in which knights were raised to positions of prominence. Amidst these concerns, ravens arrived from the north with urgent news. Queen Sansa was dealing with an internal threat of her own, a group of disgruntled lords in the White Harbor region who felt overshadowed by the new seat of power in Winterfell. She had asked if Jon could help by sending a mediator. Jon's heart ached to ride north himself, to see Sansa face to face. But he knew leaving Storm's End for an extended period could unravel the delicate progress had made. Instead, he sent Brienne, trusting her judgment and unwavering sense of fairness. Brienne departed with a small retinue, riding out on a crisp morning, the storm clouds receding into the horizon. During her absence, Jon often found himself alone in the great hall at night, dinner finished, the hall nearly empty. The ghostly echo of footsteps on the stone floors sometimes made him recall the feasts at Winterfell, the warmth of the hearth, the presence of family. Storm's End was strong, but it had never been his family seat. And yet, he was lord here, charged with its well-being. He wondered if this was the fate of all who found themselves in positions of power, a certain loneliness that lingered at the day's end. As time wore on, that loneliness was broken only by occasional visits from those he trusted. Tormund would pass through, restless as ever, not content to stay in one place. He'd regale Jon with stories of free folk struggling to adapt to lands south of the Wall, or new settlements along the Gift. Each time Tormund came, he would clash comically with the southern knights, who could not fathom the wildlings' bluntness and crude humor. But Jon was always glad to see him. The companionship reminded him of a simpler time, when they fought side by side against the Night King. On one such visit, Tormund brought with him a surprise, a letter from Arya delivered to him by a brave sea sailor in White Harbor. Arya spoke of distant shores beyond the Sunset Sea, of wonders and dangers, of storms that made even the sea off Storm's End look tame. She wrote that she missed them all, but that she had to follow this path. "I'll come back one day maybe," she wrote. But not yet. Jon felt a bittersweet pang reading her words. She'd always been a wanderer, never suited to a quiet life. He hoped she found what she sought. The months continued to roll forward, each bringing new challenges. Jon oversaw the expansion of farmland on the fertile patches of land near the coast. He encouraged the small folk to build more resilient homesteads that could withstand the storms. He established new watchposts along the roads, manned by knights who had proven their loyalty. Occasionally, he would receive word of bandits stirring in the forests near the marchlands that bordered the Reach, and he would dispatch patrols to quell them. Gradually, under his leadership, the Stormlands began to stabilize, trade began to flow, and people who had fled during the war returned to reclaim their homes. With stability came the seeds of prosperity. Merchants grew bolder, sailing from Dorne and Old Town to Storm's End, bringing their wares. A small market village sprang up outside the fortress gates, bustling with vendors hawking goods from across the realm. Jon, initially uncomfortable with too many people crowding near the castle, soon realized it was a sign of growth. He encouraged fair taxation, mindful not to push the small folk too hard in these early stages of recovery. He saw how these markets gave people hope and purpose. Amid the clatter of commerce, the swirl of new faces, and the constant roar of the sea, Jon's reputation began to crystallize. People spoke of him as a just lord. Though quiet and sometimes distant, his northern reserve never fully shaken. They whispered about how he had once been king in the north, how he had fought the army of the dead. Rumors still lingered about his Targaryen blood, but they were overshadowed by the stories of his deeds, of how he had personally saved lives on the battlefield. The small folk respected that, and in time, the Stormlords grew more inclined to trust him. With trust came loyalty, and with loyalty came a cautious sense that perhaps the Stormlands had found a worthy guardian after so much loss. Nevertheless, not all accepted him. Some of the old guard clung to the memory of House Baratheon, muttering that the crown and the realm were in too great a state of flux. Jon heard rumors of clandestine gatherings, where a few disgruntled knights talked of restoring a true Baratheon to Storm's End, or forging an alliance with uncertain powers overseas. Yet these rumors never coalesced into open rebellion. Even so, Davos and the castle master-at-arms kept a close watch, ensuring that such discontent did not fester and grow. In quieter moments, Jon sometimes ventured alone to the beaches below Storm's End. The path down was steep and rocky, but he had grown fond of the crashing waves and briny air. He would stand at the water's edge, ghost prowling nearby, gazing out at the endless expanse of ocean. Part of him longed for the cold emptiness beyond the wall, a life free from the labyrinth of politics. But that was another man's story, another man's life. The world had changed, and so had he. One dawn, as a pale sun broke through ragged clouds, Jon decided he would visit a remote village that had been petitioning for assistance. They claimed frequent raids by bandits from the Dornish marches. With a small escort of knights, Jon rode through the winding forest roads, passing giant oaks battered by storms. The party came upon the village's simple huts, the people hollow-eyed and fearful. They greeted him with reverence, calling him "my lord," some even bowing low. Jon dismounted and spoke with the village headman, an older man with a scar across his cheek. "Our menfolk are afraid to go hunt or gather timber," the headman explained. "We're set upon by thieves who steal our game and burn our traps. We lost 3 men this month alone." Jon nodded solemnly and glanced around, seeing the anxious faces peeking from doorways. Hunger showed in their eyes, along with despair. He resolved that this village would not be left to suffer. That evening, he and his knights worked with the villagers to set up a perimeter of watchfires. They baited the bandits, leaving fresh game in sight. Sure enough, just after midnight, figures crept from the surrounding trees, slipping toward the bait. The knights leapt into action. A brief skirmish erupted in the flickering firelight, steel meeting steel. Ghost lunged from the shadows, silent but deadly, knocking one bandit to the ground. The outlaws, ragged and ill-armed, stood little chance against trained knights. By dawn the threat was ended. Some of the bandits dead, others captured and bound. Jon oversaw the interrogation. These outlaws were not monstrous in countenance. They were simply desperate men, driven to crime by hunger and the chaos of recent years. He ordered them to face justice, but also offered the survivors a chance. Swear fealty, submit to proper punishment, and afterward, They could earn honest work in the new shipyards or farmland. Some spat at the notion, but a few, broken by the life they had led, agreed. It was no easy choice for Jon, but Sansa's counsel echoed in his mind. We have to break the cycles of vengeance. So he tried, in his own way, to do just that. This hands-on approach earned him the respect of the villagers, who offered him and his knights simple meals, homemade bread and salted fish. Jon sat among them at their rough-hewn tables, listening to their stories of hardship. He told them that better days would come, that Storm's End would not abandon its people. They believed him because they saw his sincerity, and in that moment, Jon felt a flicker of something warm in his chest, purpose perhaps, or a sense of belonging. The villagers called him Lord Snow, but they spoke his name with a kind of gratitude he had rarely encountered before. Upon returning to Storm's End, Jon found new letters waiting from King's Landing. One bore Bran's seal. The king wrote that he had heard news of Jon's successes, praising him for the stability he was bringing to the Stormlands. Bran asked Jon's counsel on several matters, from the reorganization of the Gold Cloaks to the question of how best to handle trade with the Iron Bank. Jon was surprised that Bran would seek his advice on such weighty topics, but it stirred a sense of pride to know his royal brother valued his input. Another letter came from Tyrion Lannister, who served as Bran's hand. Tyrion's words were both congratulatory and probing, inquiring about the state of the southern roads, the new ships, and the mood of the Stormlords. The realm needs men like you, Tyrion wrote. Those who do not thirst for power, yet wield it with a steady hand. Keep your wits about you, though. Sometimes the greatest storms are not the ones that batter the walls, but the ones that brew within them. Jon read those words carefully, wondering what storms might already be brewing within Storm's End. He would soon learn that peace in Westeros was a fragile tapestry, and stray threads could unravel it swiftly. Word reached him that a lord in the Crownlands, embittered by lost lands and titles, had begun to raise a small army in protest against King Bran's rule. Some whispered that he was in league with sellswords from across the narrow sea, men who had once served the Golden Company. Though the threat was not yet overt, it signaled the first real rumblings of insurrection since the wars had ended. The question arose: would the Stormlands march to put down such threats, or would that duty fall to the Crown's forces? In council with Sir Davos and the Stormlords, Jon weighed the possibilities. If this rebellious lord gained momentum, it could embolden other malcontents. Yet if they responded with overwhelming force, it might plunge the realm back into bloodshed. Jon had no desire for more war. He decided to send envoys to King's Landing to coordinate a measured response. In the interim, he quietly mustered some forces near the border, not for attack, but to show preparedness should events escalate. Life continued in this tense equilibrium. Storm's End's halls were no longer so quiet. Petitioners arrived daily, seeking judgments and favors. Craftsmen set up workshops in the bailey, forging tools and weapons. The clatter of industry mixed with the constant roar of the sea. And through it all, Jon Snow walked the corridors, listened to his stewards, and tried to discern the best path forward for each decision he faced. Then, on a wind-swept afternoon, a raven arrived from the north with a message that shook him to the core. Queen Sansa had taken ill, struck by a fever that left her bedridden. The maesters in Winterfell were doing all they could, but she was gravely weakened. The letter from Brienne and Maester Walken urged Jon to come if he could. Jon felt his heart lurch. He had always known such tragedies were possible. This was Westeros after all, and winter's chill was not entirely gone. But Sansa had always seemed so resilient, so capable. Jon gazed at the lines of the letter, blinking away the sting in his eyes. He had never felt more torn. Duty demanded he stay in the Stormlands with all its precarious politics and responsibilities. But love and the memory of the sister who had guided him, who had believed in him, demanded he ride north. Sansa was the last of his siblings on Westerosi soil. Arya had gone west. Bran wore the crown in King's Landing, and Rickon was gone. The thought of losing Sansa as well was unbearable. He gathered his council. Sir Davos, in his unassuming loyal way, insisted that Jon should go. You've done enough to stabilize the Stormlands for the moment. The roads are safer, The lords are calmer. Let me hold things here. We can rely on Brienne's input if there are issues with the north. You must see your sister." Others raised concerns about the rebellious stirrings in the Crown lands, but ultimately they agreed that family was paramount. Jon decided. He would ride to Winterfell with a small guard, leaving Sir Davos to administer in his absence. There was no telling how long he might be gone. Storm's End might be tested by his absence. But he could not forsake Sansa. And so on the following day, beneath a sky heavy with gray clouds, Jon Snow donned his traveling cloak and mounted his horse. Ghost padded beside him, a silent sentinel. A modest retinue of knights formed behind him. At the gates of Storm's End he turned back to glance at the castle, its massive walls rising from the rocky coast. Wind whipped at his hair. He felt a pang at leaving this place that had grown to rely on him, and, in its own way, had started to become a home he never expected. "Take care of them," he said quietly to Sir Davos, who stood by the portcullis. "If you need anything, send word to Winterfell." "Aye, my lord," Davos said with a respectful dip of his head, the faint trace of a smile curving his lips. "Go to your sister. We'll keep the storms at bay until your return." Jon urged his horse forward, the retinue following. They rode out into the storm-lashed terrain, where roads twisted among the coastal cliffs. Rain spattered the ground. Jon thought of how the fortress might fare without him in the coming months. He trusted Davos' wisdom, and many knights had pledged their loyalty in recent times. But still, worry gnawed at him. He was responsible for these lands now. Storm's End was a trust he had sworn to uphold. Yet if Sansa needed him, he would be there at her side. For all that they had endured, for all that they had become, they were still family. As they set forth on the King's Road, the storms of the south gave way to the rolling plains of the Reach, then to the Riverlands, and eventually they would cross into the north, where winter's breath lingered. Every mile took Jon Snow farther from the fortress where he had carved out a new life, and nearer to the home where his old memories and his sister waited. He pressed on, the wind raking across his face, Ghost running at the flank. The journey would be long, and the future uncertain. But he had once been a man of the Night's Watch, sworn to serve the realm. He had been a bastard, a commander, a king, and now a lord of the South. He had faced the walking dead, faced dragons and kingslayers, and the heartbreak of duty. He would face this too, with the stoic resolve that had carried him this far. In his mind's eye, he saw Storm's End's towering silhouette against a stormy horizon, that symbol of defiance and endurance. The future of the realm might still be riddled with dangers, but Jon Snow would not falter. He had given his word to these lands, and he would return to see his oath fulfilled. For now, though, he rode north for family, as any Stark, or Targaryen, or Baratheon, or Snow would do when called by the bonds of blood and love. The winds of the south howled behind him, and he rode onward, uncertain but unwavering, into whatever fate the Seven Kingdoms still had in store. Jon Snow and his escort rode north through the forests and plains of the Stormlands, the sky a steely gray as if grieving his departure. Though his heart was heavy with concern for Sansa, he could not entirely shake the sense of obligation he felt toward the lands he was leaving behind. Ever since Bran had named him Lord of Storm's End, every decision he made carried weight. Even now, setting off toward Winterfell, he felt as though invisible threads tied him back to that great fortress on the southern coast. But Sansa was his family, the only true Stark still in the north, and if she was ill, he would be at her side. Ghost trotted faithfully beside his horse, silent as snow, his ears pricking at every rustle in the brush. The knights that rode with Jon were cautious and disciplined, wearing the emblem of the crowned stag and subtle direwolf on their cloaks. A few months ago, those same cloaks had been brand new, their seams stiff with fresh dye. Now the fabric was worn with use, the gold of the stag dulled by wind and rain, and the white of the wolf partly stained to gray. Yet this was the mark of honest duty, and Jon liked seeing that badge of authenticity on those who followed him. It meant they served more than a sigil, they served the people. They traveled westward first, hugging the coast for a time, then cutting inland to reach a main road that would take them around the Blackwater Bay. The air was damp with the lingering breath of storms, and the roads were slick with mud. Twice, they had to wait for the tide to recede, so they could cross certain low-lying areas, and more than once, they found entire sections of roadway washed out by flood. Each delay frayed Jon's patience. He imagined Sansa lying feverish in her bed, possibly fading with each passing day. Anxiousness gnawed at him, urging him onward. But reason and experience told him that pushing too fast might doom them all to accidents or injuries, and that would not help Sansa in the least. After a week of travel, the company crested a gentle rise to see the broad sweep of the Rosby below. Great fields and meadows spread out, dotted with the first signs of spring color. They were nearing the borders of the Reach, and even this far from Highgarden, the fertility of the land was evident. A faint haze of pollen hung in the air, the sun struggling to break through. Jon paused to take a measure of the day. Even from here, he could see a caravan in the distance. Merchants, perhaps, or travelers. The roads were safer these days, but no place in Westeros was entirely free from the threat of outlaws. His men guided their horses along the gentle decline, mindful of where hooves might slip. At a shallow ford across a nameless stream, they encountered a group of peddlers and farmers who recognized the heraldry on Jon's party. The farmers approached, hands trembling slightly, and asked if Lord Snow might bless their journey. They had lost nearly everything in the wars and had only recently returned to their homesteads. Jon dismounted and spoke with them, offering no lofty blessings. He was no Septon, but a few calm words of reassurance and a promise that the Stormlands were becoming safer for trade. He felt odd speaking so formally of a place he already missed, but the farmers seemed heartened. One old woman even pressed a small token into Jon's hand, a bit of carved driftwood in the shape of a wolf's head. "Bless you, my lord," the woman said, voice wavering with age. "You're a good man. May the gods keep you safe." Jon nodded, quietly moved, and handed the token back to her. "Keep it," he said gently. "Pray for my sister in Winterfell instead." The woman's eyes shone with understanding, and she clutched the token to her chest. As Jon remounted, he couldn't help but think about the strange turns his life had taken. If he were still a brother of the Night's Watch, these farmers would have paid him no mind. Now, even as he traveled in uncertain times, he was seen as a symbol of protection. The responsibility weighed on him like a chain of unseen links, each link a life saved or a hope fueled. Duty was heavy indeed. At night, the escort camped under the open sky, or found lodging in whatever modest inns dotted the road. More than a few villagers recognized Jon's name, though they whispered it as though unsure if he truly was the bastard of Winterfell, who had become king in the north, then nothing, then Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and now Lord of Storm's End. Jon never bothered to correct their confusion. So many titles felt like borrowed clothing that never quite fit. The nights passed with the quiet crackle of campfires, the songs of distant frogs, and the watchful presence of Ghost, whose red eyes were a steady comfort in the dark. Once or twice Tormund Giantsbane appeared in Jon's dreams, calling him "your southernness" and laughing at him. Jon would wake with a start, unsettled by how vivid the dream felt. Perhaps he missed Tormund's brash laughter more than he cared to admit. On the 10th day, they reached an intersection where a narrower road veered east toward King's Landing. Some travelers said that caravans headed from the Crownlands to the city had become fewer, likely due to the rumors of a rebellious lord who had begun gathering men. Jon was tempted to ride east to look into the matter, but he knew the king's men and Gendry's soldiers were likely already monitoring the situation. He could not afford to be diverted. Sansa's plight mattered more to him. With a silent sigh, he pressed onward, turning his horse north, and his knights followed without question. Each new league carried them through changing terrain. The softness of the Reach gave way to the more temperate lands of the Riverlands. They passed near the remnants of old battlefields, broken spears and rotted siege towers, monuments to the war that had so recently shaken the realm. Jon saw farmers slowly reclaiming these devastated patches, tilling soil that still bore scars of fire and blood. The image stirred memories of the Battle of the Bastards, of Winterfell locked in the cold grip of Ramsay's cruelty, of the bitter nights on the wall. He thought of the White Walkers, the swirling snow, the dark horizon lit by cold blue eyes. Everything felt strangely distant, as though it had happened in another lifetime. At one point, they rode through a small hamlet that had erected a crude statue in honor of those who fought the army of the dead. Jon saw that it bore a resemblance to a rough-hewn direwolf, its eyes painted red. The villagers did not specifically mention him, but he sensed the hush in their tone as he passed, and the quick, curious glances from children peeking behind fences. Some offered the travelers fresh water or goat's milk. Jon accepted graciously, distributing a few silver stags as payment. The hamlet's headman tried to refuse the coins, but Jon insisted. "This is for your hospitality," he said, meeting the man's eyes. "Save it for the cold days still to come." The headman bowed. "You've done enough for us already. They say you were at the battle for the dawn." Jon simply nodded. He had never taken pride in that terrible fight, only relief that the living had prevailed. After they departed, Jon found himself unaccountably melancholy. The battles for the dawn, for the Iron Throne, for the realm, had consumed so many lives, and yet here was the realm, persisting in fits and starts, carrying on as though it all might simply fade into the pages of history. Would Storm's End fade too someday? And what of Sansa, if the fever proved too strong? Pushing those grim thoughts aside, Jon and his escort continued. The air grew chillier as they neared the neck. The bustle of the more populous southern lands gave way to sparse moorland, where the sky seemed broader and the wind carried a hint of northern cold. Jon felt his spirits lift despite the urgency in his heart. This was closer to home, closer to the land that, for all its harshness, had shaped him into who he was. He began to see more pine trees interspersed with oaks. The ground was rocky, the streams colder, and the nights grew long again. They stopped briefly at the Twins, where House Frey had once ruled. Now the seat was held by a cousin of Walder Frey, who had shown loyalty to the Starks and Tullys after the wars, granted mercy by the Queen in the north in exchange for unwavering fealty. The current lord was a small man with big ideas, eager to curry favor with any visitors from Winterfell. He provided lodging in one of the Twins' lesser towers. Over dinner, he prattled on about how he was improving the crossing and making sure his men never forgot their humiliating family history. Jon listened politely, not offering more than the occasional curt nod. He had no intention of indulging the Frey's desire for redemption. They'd earned the realm's mistrust with their red wedding treachery, and though the new lord might be different, some stains never washed clean. He left at first light, refusing the lord's offer of a better breakfast. Jon's night seemed relieved. The atmosphere of the Twins felt tainted by old ghosts. Once they were clear of the bridge, a grizzled knight muttered under his breath, "7 save us from ever needing Frey hospitality again." A few others murmured agreement. At Moat Cailin, the winds turned even sharper. Once an ancient fortress guarding the entrance to the north, its ruins loomed dark and grand. Several crumbling towers jutted against the sky like shattered teeth, the bogs all around them teeming with unseen creatures. Once, the walls here had been said to be impenetrable. Now they served as a border checkpoint for any who sought entry into the north. A small contingent of northern soldiers manned the partial fortifications, their banners flying the direwolf of House Stark. When they saw Jon approach, some recognized him immediately and saluted with genuine respect. They asked if he wished to rest, but Jon pressed on. Every hour mattered. 2 more days of travel along the King's Road brought them ever nearer to Winterfell. The trees grew taller and more densely packed, and the cold in the air felt comforting somehow. Jon had not been in the north for many months, not since leaving to take up his seat at Storm's End. He felt a knot of longing and worry in his belly, each emotion churned by the other. Memories of boyhood drifted through his mind, training in the courtyard, wrestling with Robb, watching Bran climb walls he shouldn't, protecting Arya from Sansa's barbed words when they argued, and hearing the ghostly howls of direwolf pups in the Godswood. And in those days he had never expected that one day he would ride into Winterfell as a stranger of sorts, no longer simply Ned Stark's bastard, but the Lord of Storm's End returning from the far south. On a cold, crisp morning, the watchtower that overlooked the approach to Winterfell finally came into view. Snow dusted the ground, though the worst of winter had retreated and the land was beginning to thaw. Jon urged his horse faster, spurred on by the sight of the familiar walls rising against a pale sky. Plumes of smoke rose from the castle's chimneys, and he found himself overwhelmed by the swirl of emotions that came with being home. Knights at the gate recognized him. One of them, a tall northerner with a thick black beard, called out, "Open the gates for Lord Snow!" The portcullis rattled, chains groaning as it lifted. Winterfell was quieter than he remembered. Fewer travelers milled about the courtyard, and the usual bustle of day-to-day life seemed subdued. Stable hands came to take the horses, bowing to Jon with a deference that felt strange. He didn't like lording himself over his own home, yet he knew many of them viewed him as a distant figure of legend by now. King, bastard, slayer of the dead, unburnt Targaryen scion, or any other rumor that had circulated. None of that mattered in this moment. All that mattered was Sansa. He strode across the courtyard, Ghost close at his heels, the wind cutting across the open space. Up ahead he saw a solemn-faced Maester Wolkan hurrying to greet him, accompanied by Brienne of Tarth. Relief flickered in Jon's chest at the sight of Brienne, safe and hale. She had ridden north some time ago, and it seemed she was still here, tending to matters for the Queen in the north. "Jon," Brienne said, inclining her head. Despite his rank, she never called him "my lord." She treated him more like an old friend, or at least a close ally. "I'm glad you've come." Sansa's condition remains uncertain. Jon's throat tightened. "Take me to her." Brienne's expression softened with compassion. She led him inside, Maester Wolkan trailing behind, offering hushed explanations of what treatments they had tried. Jon listened, though the words felt like knives in his ears. Herbal draughts, poultices, leechings. Sometimes Sansa improved slightly, only to relapse with fever and chills that left her delirious. They feared an infection that had taken root and would not yield to their usual remedies. The hallways were warmer than outside, fires blazing in hearths. Jon walked quickly, the old stones echoing with the sound of his boots. Ghost would have followed, but Brienne gently held the direwolf back. No one wanted unnecessary commotion near Sansa's sickbed. Jon paused, gave Ghost a single, reassuring touch on the head, then continued on alone. They climbed a spiral staircase to the private chambers used by the Lady or Lord of Winterfell. Jon remembered the last time he'd been in those chambers, the day he left the north to plead with Daenerys Targaryen for aid against the White Walkers. He never imagined returning under such dire circumstances. Outside Sansa's door stood two of her guards, stoic men with House Stark's sigil on their cloaks. They bowed at Jon's arrival and stepped aside. Brienne opened the door softly, allowing Jon entry. The room beyond was dim, the shutters drawn to keep out the chill, though a faint line of light seeped through a crack in the window's frame. It smelled of herbs and sweat, the telltale scent of sickness. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Sansa lay in a large bed piled with furs, her face pale and damp with perspiration. Her long auburn hair was splayed across the pillows, dull with sweat. She looked so small, smaller than Jon ever remembered. Once, she had been a girl with dreamy eyes who yearned for stories of chivalry and knights. Then she grew into the Lady of Winterfell, all cold grace and steeled resolve. Now, she looked like a fragile wraith. Jon approached slowly, his heart pounding. He whispered her name. At first, she did not stir. He laid a gentle hand on her forehead. Her skin felt clammy, warmer than it should be, and she shifted with a feeble murmur. When her eyes opened, they were glazed and unfocused, but she seemed to register his presence after a moment. "Jon." The word was faint, barely more than a breath. He swallowed hard. "I'm here. You're going to be all right." It was a reflexive reassurance, one he wasn't entirely sure of, but he had to say it. Maester Wolkan hovered at the bedside, explaining in hushed tones how the fever came and went in waves. "We believe there's an infection in her lungs or blood. She coughs at night, complains of pains in her chest. Then the fever surges, leaving her in delirium." He glanced at Jon apologetically. "We're doing all we can." Jon nodded, keeping his gaze on Sansa. She blinked at him as though fighting to stay awake. Her lips parted, trying to form words. But it took effort. "You came," she managed. "Of course I did," he murmured. He took her hand in his, feeling how frail her fingers were. There were times in the last few years when Sansa had been the strongest person he knew, when her cunning mind and fortitude saved them from impossible odds. Seeing her like this, fighting a battle against her own body, nearly broke him. Brienne spoke from a respectful distance. "She's been ill for nearly 3 weeks. It started as a mild fever, but it worsened. She insisted on attending to her duties for as long as possible, receiving petitions, managing disputes between lords. She only took to bed when she could no longer stand. That was 8 days past." Mandarin Tao. Jon squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, anger surging at how unstoppable Sansa tried to be. He admired her sense of duty, but now it might cost her dearly. He looked at the maester. "Tell me what else can be done. Do we need to send for more maesters from the citadel? Or find some rare remedy? Whatever it takes, whatever can save her, do it." Maester Walken hesitated. "I've sent ravens to the citadel. We're waiting on a reply with recommendations. But there's no miracle cure that we know of. We must keep her fever down, keep her resting, and hope her body fights off the ailment." Jon's jaw tightened. He reached up and brushed a damp strand of hair from Sansa's face. "You're stronger than this," he whispered, voice thick. "We faced the Night King together. You faced Ramsay. You can face this too." She did not respond, only let out a low moan as if in pain, her eyelids fluttering closed again. Her grip around Jon's hand tightened for a moment, then slackened. He gently placed her hand on the blankets and stood there, helpless fury and sorrow mingling in his chest. Brienne touched his arm. "Take heart. Maester Walken's potions have kept her alive this long. If the Citadel has any wisdom to offer, we'll know soon." Jon nodded stiffly, unwilling to speak for fear his voice might betray how close he was to losing his composure. He had seen men die by the hundreds, had faced monstrous foes, but this quiet enemy of sickness felt terrifying in its own way. A subtle killer that could steal a life without crossing swords. All he could do was wait. He refused to leave Sansa's side that first day, ignoring entreaties to rest. He sat by her bed, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, listening to her strained breathing. Now and then her eyes would open briefly, and she would stare at him with a flicker of recognition, sometimes murmuring about Winterfell, or Tyrion, or the last time she had walked the battlements. Once, she whispered something about Father and Stark. Jon had to turn away to hide the tears that threatened to spill. Hours passed in a blur. Servants entered quietly to stoke the fire or bring fresh water. Jon's knights waited outside or settled into the guest quarters. The castle steward politely informed Jon that Queen Sansa had left instructions about meals and hospitality for visitors, though the steward now looked to Jon for guidance. Jon simply told him to continue as they had, promising he would address larger matters once he had a chance to assess the situation. For now, Sansa was his only focus. On the second day of his vigil, a raven arrived from the citadel. Maester Walken opened it with trembling fingers, and hope flickered in his eyes for a moment, only to dim as he read. The letter contained no miraculous cures, only standard treatments and suggestions they had already employed. "We'll keep trying," Walken said quietly. "I have an idea for a stronger broth with certain herbs. Perhaps if we can keep her nourished and hydrated, it will help." Jon nodded. "Do whatever you must," he said again, feeling the words grow stale in his mouth. He could not shake the sense of frustration, as if he were standing in a corridor with locked doors on every side. But he was no maester, had no skill in healing. The battles he knew how to fight required swords and cunning, not patience and prayer. That evening, Jon finally let Brienne talk him into taking a brief walk. She led him through Winterfell's corridors, pointing out the new tapestries and improvements Sansa had made since Jon's departure. The halls were well lit, the corners free of dust. Sansa had insisted on efficiency and order in all things. Brienne stopped by a window that overlooked the courtyard. "Look," she said softly. Below, a small group of Winterfell's people lit lanterns and walked in a circle, praying for the Queen's recovery. Their voices rose in a hushed chant that carried on the wind, a heartfelt communal act of faith. "They love her," Brienne murmured. "She's been a good queen." Jon's eyes stung. "I know," he said, voice tight. "She worked so hard to keep the North strong, to give our people the security they deserve. If we lose her—" "Don't," Brienne said firmly, her expression set. "Don't speak that way. She's still alive. We fight for her while she fights this fever." "No." Jon drew a shaky breath and nodded, eyes fixed on the flickering lanterns. He realized how many people depended on Sansa, how her leadership had kept them unified after the wars. If she died, the North would face a precarious future. Would Bran step in and rule from afar? Or would the Northern lords clamor for someone else to take her place? It was a terrifying question, and the realm was too fragile to endure another succession crisis. All that talk of unity and peace, and here they were, perched on a knife's edge, the fate of the North hinging on Sansa's labored breathing. He slept little that night, dozing fitfully in a chair near Sansa's bed. Dawn came gray and cold, the faint glow slipping through the shutters. He rose stiffly, rubbed his eyes, and checked on Sansa. Her skin felt less clammy, but Wolkan said her fever had simply subsided for a time, and might surge again soon. Jon gently roused her, coaxing her to drink a bit of the herbal broth. She drank, then mumbled something about the crypts, but when Jon asked what she meant, she slipped back into a half-sleep. Day by day, time became a blur of hope and dread. Sansa's fever would abate, and she'd show signs of lucidity, just enough for Jon to begin believing she'd recover. Then it would flare again, leaving her delirious and shaking under the furs. Her cough worsened, and they often heard her struggling to draw a full breath. Maester Wolkan burned medicinal herbs on the brazier, claiming the fumes might help clear her lungs. The entire chamber smelled like a mixture of pine tar and lavender. Jon found it cloying, but if it helped Sansa, he endured it. Outside that sick room, Winterfell's affairs needed tending. The steward brought urgent matters to Jon. Trade negotiations that Sansa had begun with the Vale, petitions from mountain clans, disputes between lesser houses that needed arbitration. For all Jon's reluctance, he found himself settling disputes at the high table in the great hall, sometimes with Brienne by his side. He realized that Sansa had left behind an intricate tapestry of alliances that demanded constant attention. The Vale sought better tariffs for their goods, as their trade routes were critical in feeding the North. Some northern lords demanded more autonomy for their own seats. White Harbor wanted additional funds to repair its docks. 100 small crises pressed in on him. He did his best, calling upon the lessons he'd learned at Storm's End. He discovered that his experiences with southern lords had, oddly enough, prepared him for managing the North's more stubborn leaders. Many of them were proud and quick to anger, but if he showed them respect and a firm sense of fairness, they tended to relent. Soon word spread that Jon was overseeing matters for Queen Sansa, while she was indisposed, and the local lords began to arrive, presenting their issues to him. He found himself spending hours each day at the high table, hearing grievances and passing judgment, then rushing back to sit at Sansa's bedside in between. It wore him down, physically and emotionally, but he endured. The realm seemed intent on putting him to work, no matter his personal anguish. In the midst of these duties, ravens arrived from King's Landing. One bore the royal seal of Bran Stark, King of the Six Kingdoms, inquiring about Sansa's health. Another came from Tyrion Lannister, the Hand, discreetly offering any assistance needed. A third letter was from Gendry, explaining that the rebellious Crownlands lord had attempted to seize a minor fortress, but had been beaten back by the City Watch and a contingent of Crown Knights. Tensions were still high, and a more decisive move might be required. Gendry asked for Jon's counsel on the matter. Jon wrote back in careful, measured words, advising a balanced approach, perhaps an offer of peace if the rebellious lord would lay down arms and surrender. If he refused, then a swift, precise strike might prevent further bloodshed. Even as he composed the letter, he wondered if he should be in the Crownlands himself, assisting the king. Instead, he was here, fighting a quieter war at Sansa's bedside. Duty divided his soul between the North and the South, but there was no question in his mind where he needed to be right now. Days stretched on, each one uncertain. Sometimes Sansa seemed almost coherent. One afternoon, Jon was at her bedside when her eyes opened, clearer than they had been in weeks. She gazed at him, and he saw a flicker of her old self in those blue eyes. "Jon," she whispered. "You're here." He leaned forward, heart pounding. "Yes," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I'm here, Sansa. I've been here every day." She tried to smile, her lips curling faintly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I let myself get so ill." He shook his head. "Don't talk like that. Just rest." She swallowed, her throat bobbing painfully. "Winterfell needs me. The North needs me." "The North needs you well," Jon said quietly. "Don't worry. I'm helping in your stead." She closed her eyes again, wincing as another wave of pain or fever burned through her. "We can't lose everything we've built," she mumbled. "Too many sacrifices." "We won't lose it," Jon promised, though fear still gnawed at him. "We'll keep it together. Just focus on getting better." She murmured something else. He thought he heard her say, "Arya," but then her voice trailed off into ragged breathing. That brief moment of lucidity faded, and she drifted back into uneasy slumber. It haunted Jon to see her so diminished. Sansa had always been the foundation upon which the North rebuilt itself after the war. Now that foundation threatened to crumble if she did not survive. He carried on with his duties. The days formed a pattern. Early mornings at Sansa's bedside, mid-mornings meeting with the steward in Brienne, afternoons in the Great Hall hearing petitions, then more time with Sansa in the evenings. Through it all, he felt a tension coiled in his chest, a constant dread that he would come back to find Wolkan shaking his head solemnly, that Sansa had slipped away at last. Every time he ascended those stairs he braced himself for the worst. And yet, to his surprise, as the days turned into weeks, Sansa did not worsen. Her fever still waxed and waned, but it no longer soared to the deadly heights of before. Wolkan's potions, combined with her own quiet resilience, seemed to hold the sickness at bay. Bit by bit, her color returned to her face, though she remained too weak to do more than murmur or doze. She began to take small spoons of broth without coughing it up. The winter chill in the air began to ease as true spring took hold. With each passing day, an ember of hope glowed brighter in Jon's heart. Brienne, who rarely left Winterfell these days, noted the improvement. "She's a fighter," the knight said simply, folding her arms as she stood outside Sansa's chambers one evening. "I've seen her endure trials that would break other people. If she can survive them, she can survive this." "Maiden?" Jon wanted to believe it, and he did. On a certain evening, after finishing his daily round of judgments in the Great Hall, he climbed to Sansa's chamber, to find her propped against the pillows, eyes open. She was pale and gaunt, but a hint of a smile touched her lips when she saw him. He let out a sigh of relief so profound he nearly staggered. "You're awake," he said, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I am," she replied, her voice thin. "I heard you've been very busy, Lord Snow." He approached and gently sat on the edge of the bed. "Only in your place, my queen," he said quietly, trying to keep the relief from making him sound giddy. Her smile widened, just a fraction. "Don't call me that. I never like to be fussed over." Jon chuckled, the sound strained by the emotion in his chest. "All right, I won't, if you promise to keep resting." She nodded, letting her head sink back into the pillows. "I will. I feel a little stronger today." "It shows," he said. He reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You've been gone from us too long, Sansa." A shadow passed over her face. "I was delirious. I remember fever dreams. I saw father and mother, even Rickon. I thought I might join them." She closed her eyes briefly. "I'm sorry I worried you." Jon felt a chill at the mention of their dead family, but he swallowed and forced a calm tone. "You don't need to apologize. All that matters is you're here now, and I think you're going to get well." She sighed. "I still have a cough. Maester Wolkan said the infection remains in my chest, but I can fight it." "Need to know why?" Jon nodded, relief washing over him like a gentle tide. "We'll get through this," he assured her. "And the North is waiting for your return to the Great Hall." Though she seemed comforted by his words, he could tell she was exhausted from even this brief conversation. He urged her to sleep, pressing a light kiss to her brow before leaving her to Wolken's care. Outside in the corridor, his step felt lighter, like a man relieved of a crushing weight. He could almost breathe again. 2 days later, Sansa was strong enough to sit up for a full hour, sipping watered-down wine and speaking softly with Jon about the state of affairs in Winterfell. She listened as he outlined the petitions, the trade deals, and the minor disputes he had settled. He expected her to be irritated by his decisions, but she nodded in approval of most of them. Only once did she shake her head. "You gave the Mormonts an exemption on their taxes for this quarter?" she asked, cocking an eyebrow. "They're proud, Jon. They might see that as charity they don't need." He grimaced. "They lost so many men during the wars, and they're struggling to rebuild." "I understand. But next time, consider a different approach, a trade arrangement or something else that preserves their pride." She coughed weakly, and her voice turned scratchy. "We Northerners are stubborn." Jon smiled. "I'll remember. Just get better. Then you can correct all my mistakes yourself." She didn't smile back, but her eyes showed warmth. "I'm proud of you. You've done well." He couldn't speak for a moment, feeling a knot in his throat. After so many years of believing he was the least of Ned Stark's children, the bastard son, overshadowed by true-born siblings, he felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude to hear that from Sansa. He simply squeezed her hand in reply. The days that followed saw steady, if slow, improvement in Sansa's condition. Her fever receded to a persistent but manageable level, and she could eat solid foods in small portions. Maester Wolken was guardedly optimistic. "She's not out of danger entirely, but her body is healing," he told Jon outside the chamber. "She'll need a fortnight or more of rest before she can resume her duties." Jon relayed the good news to Brienne, who allowed herself a smile. "I knew she'd pull through," the knight said. "She's too stubborn to die." Even so, Sansa's weakness meant Jon had to remain at Winterfell for a while longer, overseeing the daily governance of the North. Ravens still flew in from King's Landing with updates about the Crownlands rebellion. Gendry wrote that the rebel lord had fortified a holdfast and refused all terms of surrender. King Bran's patience was wearing thin, and Tyrion was urging a quick resolution. One letter even asked if Jon might return south to help lead the final negotiation or confrontation, but Jon shook his head at the thought. He would not leave Sansa until she was fully on her feet again. He wrote back, advising Gendry and Tyrion to proceed without him. "You have the resources. Show him mercy if he yields, but do not let him mar the realm's peace. The people have had enough war." Between overseeing Winterfell and monitoring Sansa's recovery, Jon found little free time. Nevertheless, he managed to slip away every now and then to walk the ancient halls, reacquainting himself with the castle that was once his childhood home. Some parts were unchanged, the crypts below, the cold stone passages leading to the library. But in other respects, Winterfell bore the mark of Sansa's leadership. The walls had new tapestries depicting the victory against the Night King, the restoration of the North, and even one piece that subtly hinted at Jon's crowning as king in the North, though Sansa's figure was more prominently embroidered. He observed the skilled needlework, quietly touched by how the realm was remembering those momentous events. He also took time to visit the Godswood. The heart tree's face was as solemn as ever, carved into the ancient weirwood trunk. Red leaves still clung to the branches, rustling softly in the northern breeze. Jon knelt on the mossy ground, closing his eyes. In the distance, he heard the faint trickle of the hot springs that fed Winterfell's warmth. He thought of his father, of the old gods, of all that had transpired. Sometimes he felt the presence of those who had gone before him, Ned, Robb, even Bran as a child. He prayed silently, though not in any formal sense, asking for continued strength and for Sansa's complete recovery. The gods gave no direct answer, but the hush of the forest soothed him all the same. Weeks slipped by. Sansa grew strong enough to leave her bed and sit by the window, watching the courtyard below. She couldn't walk unassisted yet, but with Brienne or Jon supporting her, she managed brief strolls through the corridors. The color gradually returned to her cheeks, and the cough subsided to a faint rasp that flared only when she grew tired. The day she ventured down to the Great Hall for the first time, the entire castle erupted in a murmur of celebration. People bowed low, pressing hands to hearts, some openly shedding tears of joy that their queen had returned to the seat of her power. Jon stood beside her as she took her place at the high table. Her posture was upright, regal, though Jon could sense her lingering fatigue. She addressed the hall with a few humble words, thanking them for their patience and loyalty. "I am grateful to my brother Jon Snow," she said clearly, "for protecting the North in my absence, and to all of you for your steadfast hearts. We have endured dark nights before. We will endure many more, but we stand together." Applause and cheers rippled through the hall. Jon felt oddly shy in that moment, stepping back so she could reclaim her rightful place. This was Sansa's domain, and he was content to be in the background, lending support. He had never hungered for such adulation. But seeing Sansa, pale yet determined, alive and standing, filled him with relief beyond measure. That night, a modest feast was held in honor of Sansa's recovery. The cooks prepared salted cod, roast boar, turnips, and warm bread. Jon sat at the high table with Sansa, Brienne, and a few key lords who had arrived for the occasion. The conversation was cheerful, though Sansa often paused to sip tea for her throat. Jon caught her eye now and then, and she'd smile at him, a quiet thanks for everything he had done. When the feast ended, Sansa retired early. Jon lingered behind, speaking with the steward and some of the lords to finalize decisions that needed Sansa's direct input. By the time he climbed the stairs to his own chamber, he felt physically and mentally drained. But as he prepared for bed, he allowed himself the rare sensation of satisfaction. His sister was on the path to health, and the North seemed steady. For the first time in many weeks, he actually slept a deep, dreamless sleep. Come morning, the castle awakened to a light snowfall, a last gasp of winter swirling across the courtyard. Sansa wrapped herself in furs and insisted on walking the battlements with Jon by her side. Though the maester fussed that she might catch a chill, she waved off his concerns. "If we can't stand the snow," she said in a slightly hoarse voice, "we have no right to call ourselves Northerners." Jon smirked at that. They made their way slowly up the steps, Sansa leaning on Jon's arm for support. On the battlements, a cold wind tugged at their cloaks, and the castle stretched below them in a patchwork of gray stone and white flakes. Sansa inhaled deeply, her breath turning to mist. Jon remembered her once telling him how she used to yearn for southern court life, for the warmth and splendor of King's Landing. Now, she was as much a part of Winterfell as the stone itself. She glanced at him. "You'll be leaving soon, won't you?" Jon exhaled, his breath mingling with the chill air. "Yes, eventually. I owe my people in the Stormlands a return. I left Sir Davos in charge, but I can't stay away forever." He paused, glancing out toward the horizon. "I also have responsibilities in King's Landing, at least in a small way." She nodded, silent for a moment. "You've done so much for the North already. We'll manage without you, Jon, but I'll miss you." "I'll miss you too. But I'll come back when I can," he said softly. He studied her face, still a bit pale, but marked by quiet resolve. "Promise me you'll keep resting, not push yourself too hard." A small smile touched her lips. "I promise. I've learned my lesson. A queen can't lead from the grave." Jon's chest tightened at her blunt reference to her near death, but he nodded. "Good. You can count on me if you need anything. Letters, ravens, men. Storm's End can provide resources if the North ever suffers shortages." Deji said. Sansa's gaze drifted to the whitened landscape. "I'll keep that in mind," she murmured, her tone thoughtful. "It's strange, isn't it? You as the Lord of Storm's End, forging alliances with me here. Our father could never have imagined such an outcome." Jon let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Our father likely never imagined half of what's happened to us. But we move forward." She leaned closer to him, and for a moment, her head rested against his shoulder. He stood there with her in the winter wind, letting the quiet closeness speak for them both. They had lost too much family to ever take one another for granted again. Within a week, Sansa was well enough to hold longer court sessions, and Jon saw that his presence was no longer required at every turn. She took the reins of power back gracefully, praising Jon's stewardship, but gently reasserting her own authority. The lords respected her for it. Jon felt relief. The North was in capable hands once more, and he was free to think of his own duties. Yet part of him felt reluctant to leave. He had only just arrived, and the memory of the fear he had felt at her bedside was still raw. But the realm's business called to him as surely as the howling wind. Before he departed, Jon decided to pay one last visit to the crypts. He had seen them often enough as a child, walking among the stone effigies of the old Stark lords, each with a dire wolf at their feet and a sword across their lap. Now, as he descended into the gloom, torchlight flickered on the walls. Ghost accompanied him, and the dire wolf's white fur glowed eerily in the shadows. The air down there was damp, and the hush felt palpable, broken only by the soft drip of water from somewhere in the distance. Jon paused at Ned Stark's statue, gazing at the carved likeness of the man who raised him. He remembered his father's quiet dignity, his unbending sense of honor, and the countless lessons he had imparted. Beside him lay Catelyn Stark's effigy, and not far away, the memorials for Robb and Rickon. Jon's chest tightened at the sight. He sometimes wondered if Ned would have done anything differently had he known the truth of Jon's parentage from the start. Would it have changed their relationship, or the fate of the realm? He knelt down, letting the torchlight dance on the cold stone. Ghost sniffed around, ears twitching. Jon closed his eyes and whispered a few words he would never speak aloud in the daylight. "Father, forgive me, for all the things I had to do, for all the things I still must do. I hope I've made you proud." He bowed his head, and for a moment he felt something like a presence, warmth in the chill darkness, the faint pressure of eyes upon him. Perhaps he was imagining it, or perhaps the old gods listened, or perhaps his father's spirit lingered here, as the Northerners believed. Then the sensation passed, leaving him alone with the silence. He exhaled, rose to his feet, and made his way back up the winding stairs. At the top, Sansa was waiting, wrapped in a heavy cloak, a solemn expression on her face. "I thought I might find you here," she said. "Saying farewell?" Jon nodded. "Something like that." She gestured toward the courtyard where the stable hands had already prepared Jon's horse and those of his escort. "You'll be heading out at first light tomorrow?" "Yes," he said. "We should make good time, if the roads are clear. I might stop by King's Landing before returning to the Stormlands. There's the matter of the rebellion in the Crownlands to settle." She looked at him, her eyes full of concern. "You've had no rest since the wars ended. Now you govern Storm's End, you protect King Bran's realm, you come here to take care of me. Jon, it's too much for one person." He gave a half smile. "I've survived worse." She shook her head gently. "Yes, but you shouldn't always have to bear the burden alone. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help lighten your load. If the Stormlands need resources, iron for shipbuilding, timber, or even grain, let me know. The North is not wealthy, but we can spare something. You helped me, and we are family. You helped me, and we are family." Jon rested a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Sansa. I'll keep that in mind." That night, Sansa insisted that he join her, Brienne, and a few trusted advisors for dinner in her solar, a more intimate gathering than the recent feast. They drank a light golden ale from the Vale and dined on roast grouse. Sansa laughed softly at Brienne's blunt recollections of minor lords who had come to petition while she was ill, and Jon shared a humorous story about Tormund's struggle to cope with southern customs at Storm's End. A hush occasionally fell on them when they recalled how close they had come to losing Sansa, but the conversation always steered back to hope for the future. When the meal ended, Sansa pulled Jon aside, hugging him fiercely. Her embrace felt frail but determined, and he embraced her in return, pressing his forehead to hers. They stayed like that for a long moment, neither speaking, sharing the quiet bond of siblings who had lost nearly everyone else. When they parted, Sansa's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she blinked them away. Jon felt his own throat tighten, but he merely nodded farewell. At dawn, Jon rose and dressed in his travel garb once more. Sturdy breeches, leather jerkin, a heavy cloak lined with fur. Ghost paced at the door, sensing the impending journey. Jon fastened his sword belt, took one last look around the chamber that had been his for these weeks, and headed down to the courtyard. His escort was already mounted. Sansa waited near the gate, flanked by Brienne. She offered Jon a final smile, though she still looked pale in the morning light. "Safe travels, Jon," she said. "Send a raven when you reach King's Landing. And when you finally return to Storm's End, let me know how the storms treat you." He nodded. "I will." Pausing, he stepped forward and kissed her cheek. "Take care of yourself, Sansa. The North needs you." Then she touched the spot where his lips had brushed her skin, a flicker of a grateful smile appearing. "We need you too, Jon. Remember that." He nodded silently, then swung into the saddle. With a gentle nudge, he spurred his horse forward. The gates of Winterfell opened, and his party moved out onto the King's Road, the crisp morning air stinging his face. Ghost loped alongside him, the direwolf's breath puffing white in the cold. Jon allowed himself one last glance back at Winterfell's gray walls. He saw Sansa watching from the gate, a solitary figure swaddled in furs. He lifted a hand in a silent farewell. She raised hers in response. Then, the bend in the road took her from view. So began Jon Snow's journey southward again. The roads were relatively clear, though patches of ice remained in the shaded dells. He had left Winterfell in stable condition, Sansa on the mend, and the North in capable hands. As he rode, he realized that a small burden had been lifted from his soul. He had feared losing Sansa the way he had lost so many others, but fortune, or the old gods, had spared her. Now his mind turned to the next challenge, King's Landing and the rebellious lord in the Crownlands. Then, eventually, back to Storm's End, where Davos and the Stormlords awaited him. The first week of travel was uneventful, the landscapes shifting from the snowy expanses of the north to the muddy roads of the Riverlands. Inns were more frequent here, though Jon often preferred to camp beneath the stars rather than subject himself to curious stares and questions. Rumors traveled faster than riders, and many small folk recognized him, calling out to Lord Snow with awe and sometimes a hint of apprehension. He was half legend to some, half unknown to others. Around the third day, he met a band of merchants heading north, their carts laden with grain and salt fish. They told Jon that conditions were still tense around King's Landing, but the king's forces had not launched a full assault on the rebels' holdfast. Rumor claimed that the rebellious lord was desperately seeking allies, possibly from across the narrow sea. The name, Golden Company, surfaced in hushed tones, though no one was certain if any sellswords had actually arrived. Jon listened carefully, thanked them for the information, and continued on, feeling the stir of worry in his chest. Peace was still fragile, and any hint of foreign sellswords, meddling in Westeros, could reignite the flames of war. He urged his escort to pick up the pace, though he was mindful not to overtax the horses. By the time they approached the Crownlands, the weather had grown warmer, spring reigning more confidently. Trees unfurled green leaves, and buds dotted the roadside. On the horizon, Jon caught glimpses of farmland that had yet to fully recover from the devastation of Daenerys' final battle and the subsequent turmoil. Blackened patches of scorched fields were still visible in places, a grim reminder of the cost paid in Dragonfire. He felt a pang at the memory of Daenerys, her fierce conviction, her descent into madness, and the fateful moment he had driven a dagger into her heart. They arrived at the outskirts of King's Landing in the late afternoon, the city's walls stark against the sky. Much of the outer rubble had been cleared, and new construction was underway. Cranes lifted beams to rebuild sections of the city that had been burned or collapsed. The streets were dusty and crowded, people laboring to restore what had been lost. Jon and his escort made their way toward the Red Keep, noting the newly erected portions of its walls, still bearing the fresh color of unweathered stone. At the gates of the Red Keep, the gold cloaks admitted him without hesitation. Word of Jon Snow's arrival traveled quickly, and soon Gendry appeared in the courtyard, striding toward Jon with a grin that was half relief, half exasperation. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten us," he said, clapping Jon on the back. Jon dismounted and clasped Gendry's forearm. "I was delayed," he said simply, then gave a faint smile. "It's good to see you, Gendry." Gendry nodded, leading Jon into the keep. "Come on. I've got 100 things to tell you. Tyrion, too. We've been juggling half a dozen crises while Bran sits on the throne, quiet as a statue. Makes you appreciate how complicated ruling can be. Now." Jon followed him up the stairs, Ghost at his side. The Red Keep felt eerily familiar yet different. The repairs had changed some corridors, and scaffolding clung to certain walls. Servants bustled everywhere, and once in a while, someone would pause and stare at Jon, recognizing him or whispering his name. He ignored them. He had no love for the intrigues of King's Landing. All he wanted was to help settle the rebellion so he could return to Storm's End. They found Tyrion in one of the smaller council chambers, poring over maps. His hair had more silver in it than Jon remembered, and there were lines of weariness etched on his face. But he still managed a wry grin when Jon entered. "Ah, the prodigal lord returns. Welcome back to the capital. I hope your northern respite was restful." Jon sank into a chair. "Hardly restful. Sansa was gravely ill. I stayed to help until she recovered." Tyrion's expression turned grave. "I'm sorry to hear that. I trust she's better now." "She is," Jon replied. "She's well enough to rule again." Tyrion exhaled. "Good. That's a relief. One less worry. Now we can shift focus to our latest headache, a certain Lord Harren, who refuses to bend the knee to King Bran. Gendry and I have tried diplomacy, but it's like talking to a stone wall." "Bass and war." Gendry set down a flagon of ale on the table, pouring cups for them. "The man's holed up in an old fortress near Rosby. It's not a particularly strong castle, but it's enough to hold off a small force. And rumor says he's reached out to the free cities for sellswords." Tyrion drummed his fingers on the table. "So far, no sellsword company has openly landed on Westerosi shores, but we can't ignore the possibility. If they do, a minor rebellion could become a real conflict." Jon frowned, eyeing the map. He located Rosby and noted the rough terrain around it. "What does Lord Harren want?" "He claims he was cheated out of rightful lands," Tyrion said, "and that Bran is a usurper who has no blood claim to the throne. Frankly, it's nonsense. The Lords elected Bran, and Harren is just clinging to old grudges from the Targaryen era. He's desperate, but desperate men can cause great harm." Jon nodded. "Have you tried offering him anything? Or is his pride beyond reason?" Gendry shrugged. "We tried. We offered gold, a position at court, even a pardon. He refuses, says he won't live under a Stark king after what happened to the city under Daenerys." Jon's gaze darkened. "That's a poor excuse. Many suffered under the dragonfire, but we still have to move on." He glanced at Tyrion. "Where does Bran stand on this?" "Bran? Tyrion said with a sigh. "He sees things in ways I can barely understand. But he's left the resolution to me, with Gendry's help. Our options are either besiege the fortress until Harren surrenders or attempt one last negotiation. If sellswords arrive, we'll have a real fight on our hands." "And Sal?" Jon studied the map in silence. "A siege could be bloody if the fortress was well supplied. A direct assault might kill many. Another war, no matter how small, would tear at the realm's fragile peace." He thought of the Stormlands, which had begun to heal. He thought of Sansa, fighting for stability in the north. Could he find a way to end this standoff quickly? He lifted his head, eyeing Gendry and Tyrion. "Let me speak with Lord Harren directly," he said quietly. "I fought for the realm. Maybe he'll listen to me." Tyrion cocked an eyebrow. "Negotiations have already been attempted. We sent messengers, envoys. Harren refused them all." "Envoys aren't me," Jon replied. "He might still refuse, but it's worth a try. If I can convince him that I have no claim to the throne, that I only seek peace, perhaps he'll stand down." Gendry pursed his lips. "Or he might take you hostage. If you go, you should bring a sizable guard." "I'll bring a guard," Jon said. But I'll ask to speak with him personally in good faith. If that fails, then we consider the siege. I'd rather not see more blood spilled if there's another way." Tyrion and Gendry exchanged looks. Tyrion finally nodded, a small smile curving his mouth. "Very well. I've learned better than to doubt your sincerity. You might be the only man in Westeros who truly wants no throne, and that might just convince our dear rebel." Gendry scratched his chin. "All right. I'll muster some men, but we'll keep the main force back, out of sight. No sense provoking Harren if we come in force. Maybe a show of mental threat will make him more inclined to talk." "Agreed," Jon said, draining his cup of ale. He stood. "Let's not delay. Every day we give him is another day to entrench or bring in foreign sellswords." They spent the next few hours finalizing plans. Gendry would ride with Jon, but stay with a small contingent of knights outside Arrow Range. Jon would request a parley at the gates, seeking a direct audience with Lord Harren under flag of truce. Tyrion would remain in King's Landing, prepared to send reinforcements if matters escalated. The plan was risky, but time was short. Jon felt an odd stirring of purpose. This was the kind of mission he understood, trying to avert war through reason, using his name and history as a shield against bloodshed. At dawn the following day, Jon and Gendry set out with 24 mounted knights, each bearing the crown's banner. The route to Rosby took them through farmland and villages that still bore the scars of the war. It reminded Jon of how precarious peace was. People had just begun rebuilding their livelihoods. Another conflict would shatter that fragile progress. Rain pelted them intermittently, turning the roads muddy. By mid-afternoon they saw the silhouette of Rosby's fortress on a low rise, its walls not especially high, but thick enough to deter a casual assault. They halted a safe distance away. A few archers manned the parapets, their silhouettes visible against the gray sky. Gendry signaled one of the knights to raise a white flag of parley. A hush fell over the party as they waited. Eventually, a horn sounded from the fortress walls, and a voice called out, demanding to know their purpose. Jon rode a bit closer, enough to be heard without being an easy target. "I am Jon Snow," he called, his voice carrying across the rain-swept field. "I wish to speak with Lord Harren, under the protection of parley." A pause. Then the voice returned. "Lord Harren does not speak with king's dogs." Gendry muttered an oath under his breath, but Jon kept his composure. "I am no dog, and I serve no king blindly. I only seek to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Tell him that." A long silence followed. The rain pattered on the muddy ground, and the knights shifted in their saddles, hands close to sword hilts. Finally, another call came from the walls. "Come unarmed to the gate alone. If you bring a guard, we will loose arrows." Gendry glanced at Jon. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Jon nodded. "I'll be fine. Stay here with the men. If something goes wrong, do not attack unless you have no choice." Gendry's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "All right, good luck." Jon dismounted and handed his sword to one of the knights. Ghost let out a low growl, not liking the idea of being left behind. Jon gave him a reassuring pat. "Stay with Gendry," he commanded softly. Ghost's ears flattened, but he stayed near Gendry's horse. Jon raised his hands to show he was unarmed and began trudging through the thick mud toward the fortress gates. Rain trickled down his cloak, and he could feel eyes on him from the battlements. His heart pounded, but he kept his face impassive, stepping carefully over puddles. When he was within a few paces of the gate, it creaked open enough for 2 men to step out, crossbows aimed at him. "Hands where we can see them," one growled. "No tricks." Jon lifted his hands. They patted him down roughly, searching for hidden weapons. Satisfied, they gestured for him to enter. He followed them into a small courtyard inside the walls. The gate closed behind him with a hollow thud, sealing him in. More armed men circled the courtyard, each watching him closely. Jon's mind flicked through possible escape routes, but he forced himself to remain calm. If he showed any sign of fear or aggression, negotiation might fail before it began. A tall, gaunt man stood on a stone landing, wearing a cloak of dark green trimmed with gold thread. His hair was gray, and his face bore deep lines, as though carved by bitterness. Jon sensed at once that this was Lord Harren. The man stared down with undisguised contempt. "So," he said, voice echoing in the courtyard, "you're the one they call the bastard of Winterfell. The one who murdered our rightful queen, Daenerys Targaryen, and put a cripple on the throne." Jon felt a flare of anger at the mention of Daenerys, but he kept his composure. "There was no rightful queen," he said evenly. "The lords of Westeros chose Bran Stark as king. I never sought the crown for myself. I only want peace for the realm." "Peace?" Harren sneered. "You call what happened at King's Landing peace? Thousands burned alive. Houses destroyed. My own brother died in the streets that day, crushed by falling rubble when the dragon came. And I'm told you stood beside her, then stabbed her in the heart. A fine companion you turned out to be." Jon inhaled slowly, recalling the horror of that day. "I stood beside her because I thought she would build a better world. When I realized the cost was too high, I did what I had to do. I'm sorry for your brother, but the path Daenerys chose would have led to more slaughter." "Damn to be." Lord Harren's lips tightened. "And now you come to demand I bend the knee to Bran the Broken, as if he's some savior? He's a Stark, just like you, and my house remembers what Starks have done in the past." Jon glanced around at the armed men. He spoke carefully, mindful of each word. "Lord Harren, I'm not here to force your submission. I came to talk, to offer you a chance to rejoin the realm without violence. We can end this without shedding blood." Harren folded his arms over his chest. "You say that, yet your men stand outside my gates, armed and ready. You say you only want peace, yet you bring the storm with you." "I brought only a small party," Jon countered. "If we wanted to attack, we'd come with an army, not a handful of knights. You know this." Harren's eyes narrowed. "You might be cunning, bastard, but I'm not a fool. Why should I believe anything you say? You're a Targaryen by blood, Rhaegar's spawn. The same line that nearly burned this city to the ground. The same line my brother died for." "Madams." The words cut deeper than Jon expected, but he kept his voice level. "I never claimed that name. I have no desire to rule or conquer. My seat is at Storm's End, granted by King Bran. I protect the Stormlands, and I've worked to heal the scars of war there. You can do the same for your lands if you stand down and swear fealty. The king would forgive you." Harren let out a bitter laugh. "Forgive me? I don't need his forgiveness. This land is mine by right, and I'll not see it kneel to a cripple on the throne. If you have any sense, you join me, bastard. We could rally those who despise the Starks and the memory of the Mad King's daughter. The realm is ripe for a new order." "Meh." Jon shook his head. "I've seen too much war, too many families left in ashes. There's nothing for me in your new order. It would only bring more death." "You're naive," Harren snapped. "Peace is an illusion, especially under that abomination in the Red Keep. I've heard the rumors about Bran's powers. They say he's not even a man anymore, but some spirit that sees the future. This is the kind of king you want? A monster lurking in a man's skin?" Jon clenched his jaw. "Bran is my brother. He's no monster." Harren's gaze flicked to the men around the courtyard, as though measuring how much they believed. He took a step forward, and his voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "You wasted your chance to stand with true power. Daenerys was that power, and you betrayed her. I will not follow the traitor who murdered a dragon queen. Leave my fortress, or face the consequences." Jon's pulse thudded in his ears. "If I leave, this will only end in blood. The crown will besiege you. You'll lose, and many of your men will die for nothing. Is that what you want?" "Nanitor." Harren's expression contorted with rage. "They die with honor, free men not bowing to a false king. I'd rather burn than submit to a brood of cripples and bastards." Jon exhaled, a cold dread settling in his stomach. He could see that Harren was beyond reason, fueled by bitterness and a thirst for vengeance. Negotiation was doomed. "You're condemning them and yourself," Jon said, voice quiet. "Get out," Harren hissed. He gestured to the guards. Escort the bastard from my sight. If he or his men remain by nightfall, loose the arrows. Nianan. The crossbowman stepped closer. Jon lifted his hands in a sign of compliance. Don't throw away your life, he said one last time, meeting Harren's furious gaze. There's still time to reconsider. Harren turned his back with a dismissive sneer. My life is my own. You have until sunset. The guards shoved Jon toward the gate. He allowed himself to be manhandled, knowing that one wrong move could spark a deadly fray. The gate creaked open just enough to push him outside, then slammed shut behind him. He stood in the rain-soaked field, chest tight, anger roiling within him at the stubborn futility of it all. Gendry and the knights quickly rode up, eyes wary. Well? Gendry demanded. Jon shook his head, walking back to his horse. He won't yield. He wants to burn rather than bend the knee. Gendry spat. Damn fool. All right, so we try the siege. Jon winced, thinking of the innocent men within those walls who might be forced to fight for a lost cause. We have little choice, but we'll try to keep casualties low. Gendry nodded grimly. I'll send word to King's Landing. Tyrion can dispatch more men. This fortress isn't large, but Harren can hold out for some time. Jon mounted his horse, the rain stinging his eyes. He remembered the horrors of the sieges he had experienced. The starvation, the disease, the desperation. Was this truly the only way? A pang of guilt stabbed at him. But Harren seemed beyond reason, unwilling to accept even the possibility of peace. A fresh wave of exhaustion swept over Jon, as though he were Atlas carrying the realm on his shoulders. They pulled back out of arrow range and set up a temporary camp behind a low ridge. Gendry sent a rider back to King's Landing to inform Tyrion of the failed parley. Jon paced restlessly, ignoring the rain that soaked his cloak. Ghost padded after him, ears flattened in shared unease. Jon stroked the direwolf's fur. We tried, he murmured. We tried. 2 days later, additional forces arrived from King's Landing. A few hundred men led by a seasoned knight, loyal to Bran's rule. They carried the crown's banner, along with several siege engines, basic trebuchets and rams. Tyrion himself did not come, but he sent instructions. Jon read them, heart heavy. They were to surround the fortress, cut off supplies, and wait until Harren either surrendered or starved. If Harren attempted to break out, they would meet him in open battle. Above all, Tyrion wrote, keep civilian casualties to a minimum. The crown does not wish to bathe the land in blood again. Jon agreed wholeheartedly, but the nature of a siege was brutal. He oversaw the distribution of men around the fortress, ensuring no route remained open for supply wagons. A few local villagers had already fled the area, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. The tension in the camp was palpable. Rain continued for days, turning the ground into a quagmire. Morale dipped as soldiers huddled in sodden tents, and more than one cursed Harren's name for forcing them into these miserable conditions. Weeks dragged on. The men established pickets, built crude wooden walkways to keep out of the mud, and waited. Occasionally, Harren's archers loosed arrows at any soldier who ventured too close, but there were no open skirmishes. Ravens flew between the siege camp and King's Landing, with Tyrion expressing guarded impatience. The realm could not afford a prolonged siege. Harren's men could hold out for months if they had stockpiled supplies. If they had truly hired sellswards, a relief force might strike at the siege from behind. In the gloom of a rainy dawn, Jon stood at the edge of the camp, gazing at the fortress. The ramparts were silent, except for the occasional glint of a helmet. Gendry joined him, yawning and rubbing the back of his neck. This is madness, Gendry muttered. Harren must know he can't win, but he's content to wait us out. Jon nodded, lips pressed thin. He'd rather watch the realm bleed than bend the knee. Men like him can't let go of their hate. Gendry gave him a sidelong look. When do we move in? We have siege engines, but we haven't attacked yet. Jon raked a hand through his damp hair. I was hoping we wouldn't have to. But maybe we have no choice. He stared at the fortress walls. If we mount an assault, men will die on both sides. But a long siege might kill just as many through attrition. Harren won't open those gates willingly. Gendry was silent for a moment. What would you do if this were the Night King behind those walls? Jon flinched, remembering that existential threat. The Night King had no reason or desire to parley. This is different. These men have families, loyalties. I keep thinking there must be a way to reason with them. But I can't see it. A horn sounded from the pickets, signaling movement at the fortress gate. Jon and Gendry hurried to see what was happening. The gate creaked open a crack, and a single rider emerged under a white flag. The rider, cloaked and hooded, guided his horse across the muddy no-man's land toward the siege lines. Jon ordered his men to hold position, then stepped forward to meet the envoy. Rain dripped from the brim of his hood as he lifted it slightly to see the rider's face. "Who are you?" Jon called. A young man, perhaps no more than 20, lowered his hood. He had a pinched face and nervous eyes. "I'm Arlen, a squire to Lord Harren. I come to speak on behalf of the fortress garrison. We want to discuss terms." Jon's eyes narrowed. Lord Harren refused all terms before. "What's changed?" "None." The squire swallowed, glancing at the ring of armed men around him. "Most of us don't share Lord Harren's madness," he admitted in a trembling voice. "We've run low on supplies. Sickness is spreading inside. Some are willing to surrender if they can be guaranteed clemency." A murmur rippled through the soldiers. Jon raised a hand for silence. "We offer fair treatment to those who lay down arms," he said, voice steady. "We won't harm men who surrender peacefully, but what about Lord Harren himself?" Arlen's shoulders sagged. "He won't yield. He barricaded himself and a handful of loyal guards in the keep. He says he'd rather die than bow to King Bran." "Never knew." Jon exchanged a quick look with Gendry. This was a turn of events. "So you're telling me that the majority of the fortress garrison wants to lay down arms if we promise not to punish them?" Arlen nodded, wiping rain from his eyes. "Yes, my lord. We have wives and children in there. We don't want them to starve. We only followed Harren because we feared him. But now we see it's hopeless." Jon felt a surge of cautious optimism. "All right. If you truly mean to surrender, open the gates. My men will enter peacefully. Any who throw down weapons will be spared, but Lord Harren and his loyalists must face justice." "Now we're turned." A flicker of relief crossed Arlen's face. "We'll do what we can from inside, but Harren has men watching. If they suspect treachery, they might kill us before we can open the gate." Jon's mind raced. "We can stage a diversion, make it look like we're preparing an attack on one side of the wall. Meanwhile, you open the gate on the other side. We'll slip in and secure the courtyard before Harren can react." "Verstihan." Gendry rubbed his chin. "That could work, provided the loyalists don't catch on. But it needs to happen soon, before Harren notices the squire has gone too long." Arlen nodded earnestly. "Tonight, after dusk, we'll light a torch at the northeast tower if we're ready. That's your signal." Jon placed a hand on the squire's shoulder. "Agreed. I'll do everything in my power to see that your people are spared once they surrender. But if Harren attacks, we'll have to defend ourselves." Arlen's eyes shone with desperation. "We understand. We just want to end this. Thank you, my lord." He turned his horse and rode back toward the fortress, a solitary figure swallowed by the rain. Jon and Gendry immediately convened with the siege captains, outlining the plan. It would be a coordinated effort, a feigned assault on the main gate, loud and visible, while a smaller force waited near the eastern side of the fortress, watching for the torch signal. Once it appeared, they would move swiftly. The key was speed and surprise to minimize bloodshed. Dusk arrived under a lowering sky. The rain had finally slackened to a light drizzle. Soldiers readied themselves, sharpening swords, checking armor straps, and whispering to one another. Jon took a small contingent of men he trusted, knights from Storm's End, a handful of crown soldiers, and Gendry at his side. Ghost padded among them, silent and tense. They waited near the eastern wall, out of sight, while the bulk of the forces made a show of moving siege engines toward the main gate. Torches flickered in the gloom, and drums began to pound, simulating an impending assault. From the fortress walls, archers aimed nervously, uncertain whether to waste arrows. John kept his gaze fixed on the northeast tower. Minutes stretched, the sounds of the famed siege echoing across the muddy field. Then, at last, a small flame appeared on the tower's battlements. A torch waved 3 times in the darkness. That was the signal. "Move in," John ordered softly. His men advanced, boots squelching in the mire, weapons at the ready. They crept closer to the eastern gatehouse. The fortress walls loomed overhead, dripping with rain. From above, no arrows flew, a sign that the garrison might indeed be in on the plan. Suddenly, the eastern gate groaned. Its heavy wooden doors swung open just enough to allow men to slip through. John gestured for half the group to remain outside as a reserve, while he, Gendry, and the others slid inside. The courtyard was dimly lit by a few torches. Shapes moved in the shadows, armed men, but they lowered their weapons upon seeing Jon's party. "We surrender," one called out, tossing down his sword. Others followed suit, dropping shields and spears. A few women and children huddled near the walls, fear etched on their faces. Gendry's voice rang out. "Lay down arms and you'll come to no harm. Anyone loyal to Lord Harren must stand aside, or face the crown's justice." A murmur rippled through the garrison. A gray-bearded sergeant stepped forward. "We've had enough, my lord. Harren's men killed our captain when he tried to reason with them. We just want this over." John nodded. "Then help us find Harren. We want to end this with as little bloodshed as possible." The sergeant motioned toward the keep, a squat structure near the center of the courtyard. "He's barricaded in there with maybe 20 men. They posted crossbowmen at the windows." Before John could respond, the door to the keep slammed open. A volley of crossbow bolts whistled out, striking 2 of the garrison men who had come to surrender. They fell with cries of pain. Chaos erupted as people scrambled for cover. Lord Harren himself appeared in the doorway, brandishing a longsword. He roared, "Traitors! I'll gut every last one of you." A handful of fierce-eyed loyalists stood behind him, weapons gleaming in the torchlight. "Hold your fire," John shouted to his men, not wanting to hit innocents in the melee. But Harren's loyalists charged forward, swords swinging. They clashed with the garrison men who had just laid down their arms, forcing them to scramble for weapons again in self-defense. John cursed, drawing his sword. He waded into the fray, parrying a blow aimed at a cowering woman. His riposte struck the attacker in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. Another loyalist lunged at Gendry, but Gendry's warhammer swung in a brutal arc, crunching armor and bone. Ghost leapt onto a crossbowman, who tried to reload, dragging him down with savage efficiency. In the midst of the chaos, John saw Harren, raging like a madman, cutting down anyone who stood in his path, be they crowned soldier or garrison traitor. His eyes were wild, spittle flying from his lips as he bellowed curses at the stark bastards. John pushed through the melee, blocking a clumsy strike from a wounded loyalist, then hammering his pommel into the man's face. Blood spattered the stone floor. At last, John faced Harren directly, their swords clashing. Harren sneered at him with unbridled hatred. "I'll send you to the hell you deserve, bastard." John gritted his teeth. "It doesn't have to be this way," he growled, locking blades. "Surrender. End this." Harren roared and shoved John back with surprising strength, swinging his sword in a brutal arc. John dodged, the blade whistling past his ear. He countered with a quick slash, which Harren parried with practiced skill. The clang of steel echoed through the courtyard. Rain dripped from the battlements, mixing with the blood on the stones. Around them, the fight was winding down, as the loyalists were outnumbered. Gendry's hammer knocked another foe unconscious, while the garrison men subdued or slew the rest. Yet Harren fought on, unstoppable in his hatred. He rained blows on John, forcing him back, step by step. John felt the jolt in his arms with each parry, the weight of the conflict pressing down on him. "You're a plague on this land," Harren spat, slashing again. "You murdered the Dragon Queen. You let a cripple rule. You gave away the throne that should be yours by birthright. Coward." "Nenderwenny." John ducked a blow aimed at his head. "I never wanted the throne," he panted. "It's you who cling to old ghosts. You want to fight ghosts? Fine." He pivoted, letting Heron's momentum carry him forward, then slashed diagonally across Heron's torso. A cry of pain tore from Heron's lips as the blade bit through armor. He staggered, blood staining his surcoat. But with a final burst of fury, he lunged once more, aiming for Jon's neck. Jon twisted aside, driving his sword through Heron's abdomen. The rebel lord's eyes went wide, and he sank to his knees, sword clattering to the wet stone. Jon froze, breathing hard, his sword still in Heron's gut. The man coughed, blood dribbling from his mouth. "You bastard," he croaked. Jon pulled the sword free, grimacing. "It's over," he said, voice hollow. Heron toppled forward, collapsing onto the slick ground, his life pooling around him in dark rivulets. A hush fell over the courtyard. The remaining loyalists lay dead or captured. Gendry approached, breathing heavily, his hammer resting on his shoulder. "That's the end of it," he muttered. Jon merely nodded, staring at Heron's lifeless form. Another life lost, another rebellion snuffed out. He felt no triumph, only a weariness that weighed on his soul. In the aftermath, the surrendered garrison helped collect weapons and tend to the wounded. Women and children emerged from hiding, many sobbing in relief or despair. Jon walked among them, urging his men to show mercy, to help the injured, to keep the prisoners alive for a fair judgment. The fortress was theirs now, with minimal damage, but the cost was still measured in blood. By dawn, Jon stood atop the walls, looking out over the horizon where the rain clouds were finally dispersing. The sun edged over the land, casting pale gold light on the muddy fields. Gendry joined him, handing him a waterskin. Jon drank, the water washing away the taste of blood from his mouth. "We'll send word to King's Landing," Gendry said. "Tyrion will want to hear we took the fortress. He'll probably come to secure it with a new castellan." Jon nodded absently, gazing at the sunrise. "Yes," he said. "Let him. I'm ready to go home." Gendry offered him a faint smile. "Storm's End?" Jon nodded, exhaling. "Storm's End. My place is there. I've done my part here." He swallowed, voice rough. "I want no more of these battles. I just want to see the Stormlands prosper, to protect the people who rely on me." Gendry laid a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Then we'll finish up quickly and get you back to your fortress. You've earned a moment's peace." Jon turned his face to the rising sun, the warmth brushing against his skin. Heron's rebellion was ended, but the echoes of violence lingered in the air. He thought of Sansa, recovering in Winterfell. He thought of Bran, sitting on the Iron Throne in King's Landing, weighed by visions. He thought of Davos, patiently stewarding Storm's End. And he thought of all the small folk across the realm who simply wanted to live in safety, free from the ambitions of lords and kings. He closed his eyes, letting the day's light wash over him. Another war had been averted, this time, at least. The realm still teetered on the edge of disunity, with old grudges and new claimants always threatening to rise. But Jon Snow would do what he had always done, carry the burden of duty with reluctant shoulders, seeking peace where he could find it, and standing against the darkness whenever it returned. Perhaps that was the fate the gods had given him. For now, though, he would return to the storms of the southern coast, to the ancient fortress that stood unbroken by wind or tide. And there, as Lord of Storm's End, he would strive to protect what he could, for as long as he drew breath. He descended the battlements, ready to make preparations for the long journey south. Though more trials might await him along the way, he carried a glimmer of hope in his heart. Sansa lived, the rebellion was quelled, and the realm still breathed. In a land scarred by endless strife, that was no small thing. And so Jon Snow pressed forward, unwavering, into the future that continued to unfold, step by step, day by day, one storm after another.